She had $800 left in the world. Not $800 in savings. Not $800 after bills. $800 total. In her purse, in her checking account, in every pocket she owned combined. That was it. That was the whole sum of everything she had managed to hold on to after the eviction, after the car repossession, after 2 years of slowly losing ground no matter how hard she dug her fingers in and fought. And she was about to spend every single cent of it on a hole in the ground that nobody else wanted. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her name was Renata Voss. She was 34 years old. She had a 7-year-old daughter named Cora who asked too many questions and trusted her mother completely, the way only children can trust someone, with no conditions attached, no awareness that trust can be misplaced. Renata carried that trust like something fragile in her hands every hour of every day. She could not afford to drop it. She could not afford most things. The previous 18 months had taken from her in a particular and efficient way, the kind of taking that doesn't happen all at once but instead arrives in installments, polite and relentless. First came the job loss when the hotel management company she had worked for over 6 years was absorbed by a larger chain that relocated its administrative offices 3 states away. Then came the gap months, the job applications, the interviews that went well but not well enough, the freelance bookkeeping work that paid in inconsistent waves. Then came the month she fell behind on rent. Then the next month. Then the letter. Then the date. Then the truck that came and sat in front of her building while a man with a clipboard and an apologetic expression supervised the process of her life being moved to the curb. Cora had watched from the sidewalk, holding a stuffed rabbit she had named Gerald, asking if they were going on a trip. Renata had said yes. She had said it was an adventure. The shelter they ended up in was clean and run by people who meant well. There were rules and schedules and a shared kitchen that smelled permanently of institutional soup. Cora made friends quickly the way children do, crossing boundaries adults spent years constructing. Renata lay awake in the narrow bed beside her daughter each night and stared at the ceiling and made lists in her head. Lists of things she needed. Lists of options. Lists of ways forward that kept running into the same wall no matter which direction she approached from. Without a permanent address, finding a job was harder. Without a job, finding a permanent address was harder. The two problems sat across from each other like guards blocking the same door from both sides. It was during the 3rd week at the shelter that she found the listing. She had been using the shared computer in the common room, searching for rooms to rent within reach of the bus line, when an ad in the sidebar of a property listing site caught her eye. Not because it was beautiful or appealing. It caught her eye because of the price. $800. Full purchase. Not a deposit. Not a monthly rate. A full purchase price for a piece of property in Grover County, 45 minutes outside the city, described in 17 words that raised more questions than they answered. Decommissioned government installation. Underground structure. As is condition. No utilities. Cash sale only. Motivated seller. She clicked on it the way you poke at something strange on the ground. Not sure if it's dangerous. Not sure if it's nothing. Compelled anyway. The listing had 3 photographs. The first showed a flat, overgrown field with nothing visible except weeds and a rusted metal hatch set into the earth at an angle. The second showed a set of concrete steps descending into darkness, the camera's flash catching the edge of a wall and nothing more. The third was apparently taken from inside and showed a low ceiling, exposed pipes, a concrete floor disappearing into shadow, and a small face peering around a doorframe. Someone's child, maybe, from a previous visit, wide-eyed in the dark. The listing had been up for 4 months. No offers. No inquiries listed. The county tax records, which she found after 20 minutes of searching, showed that the property had passed through 3 owners in 12 years, each of whom had paid the taxes dutifully and done nothing else with it. Before that, it had been decommissioned from government use in the early 90s. The specific agency not listed, the purpose described only as civil defense infrastructure. Renata sat back in the plastic chair and looked at the screen for a long time. She told herself it was absurd. She told herself that she had $800 and a daughter and no business spending the last of their cushion on an underground structure in a county she had never visited. She told herself these things in the sensible, practical voice she had developed over years of being sensible and practical, a voice that had served her reasonably well right up until it hadn't. Then she thought about what $800 could do otherwise. It could cover another 2 months of storage fees for the boxes she was paying to keep across town. It could be spent on application fees and first-month deposits that landlords would take and then reject her for, citing insufficient income or the lack of a cosigner. It could sit in her account and shrink by $50 a month in fees and small necessities until it was gone. Or it could buy her land. A place. Something with an address. Something she owned. She wrote down the contact number and closed the browser tab before she could talk herself out of it. The call lasted 11 minutes. The seller was a man named Douglas Pell who had inherited the property from his uncle and had no interest in it beyond not wanting to keep paying taxes on it. He sounded tired and faintly relieved when she asked genuine questions. He confirmed that the structure was intact, that it extended roughly 60 feet underground, that it had been sealed for most of the past 3 decades. He had been inside twice. He described it as large, dark, and strange. He said it had pipes and rooms and old equipment that nobody had touched. He said the county had cleared it of any environmental concerns when the previous owner tried to develop it, which had come to nothing. He said there were people who liked that kind of thing, bunker enthusiasts, history people, but none of them had made him an actual offer. She made him an offer. $800, exactly. Cash transfer, immediate. There was a pause on the line. He said yes. She sat in the shelter's common room for a few minutes after hanging up, her hands flat on the table, feeling the laminate surface under her palms, solid and cool. Cora appeared in the doorway asking about dinner. Renata looked at her daughter, at the stuffed rabbit tucked under Cora's arm, at the careful and complete trust on her child's face, and felt something that was not quite hope and not quite fear, but sat precisely between the two, pressing against her ribcage like something that needed more room than she had yet given it. She told Cora they would eat soon. She told her they might be going somewhere new. Cora asked if there would be a yard. Renata said she wasn't sure yet. That was the truest thing she said that evening. The drive to Grover County took 47 minutes on roads that grew quieter and more rural as the city's edges dissolved behind her. Renata drove a borrowed car, a favor from a woman at the shelter who had lent it without asking too many questions, and Cora sat in the back with Gerald the rabbit and a library book she had checked out 3 days ago and already read twice. The morning was gray and cool, the kind of day that doesn't commit to anything, neither sun nor rain, just a flat light that made everything look slightly provisional. Renata had not told anyone at the shelter what she was doing. She had not told her sister in Ohio, who would have said she had lost her mind. She had not called her former neighbor, who was the closest thing she had to a friend in the city, and who would have said something supportive and worried at the same time. She had driven out alone, with Cora, on a Tuesday morning, to look at a hole in the ground she had already legally purchased. The sale had finalized 2 days prior, the transfer done electronically, the deed filed through a county office that processed it with the same bureaucratic indifference with which it processed everything. She was now the legal owner of 4 acres of Grover County land, and whatever sat beneath it. She had received nothing in the mail, yet confirming this. She had the transfer confirmation on her phone and the seller's last text message, which read, "Hatch key is in the lockbox. Code is 1947. Good luck." She found the property without much difficulty. The address matched a gravel turnoff from a county road, marked by a leaning post with numbers that corresponded to the deed. The field beyond it was exactly as the photographs had shown. Flat, weedy, unremarkable. The kind of land that made no claims on you, asked nothing, offered nothing visible. A crow sat on a fence post at the far edge and watched them park. Cora climbed out and stood in the weeds looking around. She said it didn't look like much. Renata said most things didn't, at first. The hatch was set into the earth at a shallow angle about 40 yards from where they parked, surrounded by a concrete lip that had heaved slightly from decades of freeze and thaw. The lockbox hung on a steel ring beside it, orange with rust at the corners, but functional. The code worked. Inside was a single key on a ring with no label, heavy and old, the kind of key made to last rather than to be replaced. Renata looked at the hatch. The hatch looked back at her. She had brought 2 flashlights, a length of rope, a first aid kit, and 2 granola bars. She had told herself she was being practical. She had not told herself she was scared, but she was, in the specific way of someone standing at the edge of a decision that cannot be undone, looking down at what they've chosen. Cora moved up beside her and looked at the hatch. "Mom," Cora said, "it's so dark in there." She said it matter-of-factly, peering at the gap where the hatch seal had separated slightly, letting in a thin breath of cool underground air that smelled of concrete and time. Not frightened, just observing, just naming the things she saw. Renata looked at her daughter. She thought about the shelter ceiling she had stared at for 3 weeks. She thought about the eviction notice and the storage unit and Gerald the rabbit and the way Cora had watched their furniture being carried to the curb and asked if they were going on a trip. She put the key in the lock. She felt the mechanism give, heavy and deliberate. She lifted the hatch, which required both hands and a hard pull, its hinges protesting with a sound like something that had been waiting a very long time to be disturbed. The concrete steps went down into darkness. She handed Cora the smaller flashlight and kept the larger one. She said, "Stay close, hold the rail, and tell me if you want to go back up." Cora said, "Okay." They went down. The steps were solid. 12 of them. At the bottom, the beam of Renata's flashlight swept across a landing and 2 heavy steel doors, both partially open, their frames intact. The air was cool and completely still, the kind of stillness that exists only underground, sealed away from wind and weather and the ordinary motion of the world above. It smelled of dust and old metal and something faintly chemical that she could not identify, something from whatever coatings had been applied to the walls decades ago. Beyond the first door, the beam of her flashlight caught the edge of a room. Large, low-ceilinged, concrete walls, and shapes, many shapes, covered by tarps and canvas sheeting that had gone gray with age, standing in rows that her light could not reach the end of. She stood in the doorway and breathed slowly. Cora pressed against her side and shone her flashlight in a different direction. "Mom," Cora said, "there's another room over there." There was, and another beyond that, and a corridor to the left that ran further than either of their lights could follow. The underground space was not the size she had expected from the photographs. It was larger, considerably larger, its footprint extending far beyond the modest surface hatch that had let them in. Rooms branched from a central corridor like chambers in something old and purposeful. Steel shelving lined the walls in some of them, still bolted in place, still holding the geometry of a space that had been organized and maintained, and then simply, one day, not. Equipment covered in canvas sat in the larger rooms. In 2 of the smaller side rooms, she found old filing cabinets, locked, made of heavy steel. In a room near the far end of the corridor, she found what appeared to be a communications array, its equipment old enough to belong in a museum, its dials and switches untouched for so long that the dust on them had settled into a permanent layer. They were underground for nearly 2 hours that first visit. Renata walked every corridor twice, checking the ceiling for structural damage, testing the floor for soft spots, trying to understand the shape of the space she now owned. The structure was solid. Whatever agencies had built it, they had built it to last. The concrete was thick, the reinforcement visible where sections of wall had been exposed by minor settling, and the steel framing around the doors showed no significant corrosion. This was a place built by people who expected it to need to function under pressure, and they had built it accordingly. She took photographs on her phone until the battery dropped to 15%, and she made herself stop. When they came back up and sat in the weeds beside the hatch, Renata ate one of the granola bars and Cora ate the other, and the crow was still on the fence post, watching them with a sideways professional interest. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed this and held them flat on her thighs until they stopped. She thought about what she had seen. The covered shapes, the sealed cabinets, the organized rows. A space that large, maintained that carefully, built by a government agency in the years when civil defense meant something serious and real, did not typically hold nothing. But she needed to be careful about what she let herself think. She needed to be methodical. She needed to think like someone who had very little margin for being wrong. She sat in the flat gray light of that Tuesday morning and began, quietly and precisely, to make a plan. The first thing she did when she returned to the shelter that night was research. She sat at the common room computer until the 11 o'clock quiet hours began and the night duty staff asked her gently to wrap up. And then she continued on her phone, lying beside Cora's sleeping form in the dark, the screen dimmed to its lowest setting. She searched for information about civil defense installations in Grover County. She searched for records of government facility decommissioning in the region. She searched for the history of underground infrastructure built during the post-war decades, the period when fallout shelters and communications relays and hardened command structures were constructed by the hundreds across the country, often in rural areas, often on land that passed to private ownership when they were no longer needed. What she found was fragmentary and suggestive. Grover County had been listed in 2 historical surveys as the site of a regional civil defense relay station, built in the early 1950s and expanded in the early 60s, intended as part of a communications network that would allow regional coordination in the event of an attack. These stations had typically included substantial supply stockpiles, communications equipment, and in some cases, physical assets transferred from earlier programs. Many had been decommissioned quietly, their contents either officially disposed of or simply left in place when the cost of removal exceeded the value of what remained. The records from this period were incomplete and unevenly archived. Some disposal records had been classified and never released. Others had simply been lost. She read this information slowly and carefully. She read it the way a careful person reads something that could mean a great deal or could mean very little, without letting herself lean too hard in either direction. The second thing she did was call a woman she had met briefly at a community legal clinic 2 months earlier, a retired attorney named Frances Okafor, who had offered her card and said to call if she ever needed a straight answer about anything. Renata called. She explained the situation without embellishment, the purchase, the space, the covered contents, the sealed cabinets. She asked what her rights were, as the legal owner of the property, regarding whatever was found inside. Frances listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Generally speaking, what is found on or in property you legally own belongs to you, subject to certain exceptions. Government property that was abandoned rather than formally transferred could theoretically be reclaimed, but the bar for that is high and the process is slow, especially for items with no active claim." She said, "Do not open anything. Do not remove anything. Do not publicize anything until you understand what you have." She said, "Document everything you can with photographs and written records before you touch a single item." Renata said she understood. Frances said, "And Renata, if there is anything valuable in there, be prepared for people to tell you it was never really yours to begin with. That is not necessarily true, but you need to be prepared to hear it." Renata said she was used to people telling her things weren't really hers. There was a pause. Then Frances said she would make some calls and get back to her. The third thing Renata did was go back to the bunker. She went the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning she could arrange the borrowed car in a few hours without Cora noticing too much of the worry that was beginning to live permanently in her expression. She brought better lights. She brought a notebook. She began the documentation Frances had suggested, photographing and writing descriptions of every item she could see without disturbing anything. Mapping the layout of the rooms with a hand-drawn diagram she refined with each visit. What was under the tarps and canvas sheeting was not immediately clear from the outside. The shapes were varied. Some were rectangular and flat, suggesting crated materials. Others were bulkier, suggesting equipment or machinery. Several were stacked in a systematic way that implied they had been placed there deliberately rather than dumped. The filing cabinets, 4 of them, were arranged along one wall of what she had decided to call the main storage room, which was the largest single space and the one that held the most covered material. She did not open anything yet. She waited. Frances called back on the 4th day. She had spoken with a colleague who worked in property law and with an acquaintance at the County Historical Society. The colleague confirmed that her ownership rights were solid. The Historical Society acquaintance had told Frances something that Frances now relayed with the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that could tip in multiple directions. The installation at Renata's address had been listed in an internal decommissioning memo from 1991, one of a batch of regional civil defense stations closed in the post-Cold War reduction. The memo noted that the contents of the facility had been assessed for disposal, but that transportation costs had exceeded the assessed recovery value of the materials, which had therefore been left in situ. Left in situ. In place. In the ground. Renata wrote those 3 words in her notebook. She drew a circle around them. She went back the next day with her best flashlight, a pry bar she had borrowed from a maintenance cabinet at the shelter after asking permission, a camera, and her notebook. She stood in the main storage room and looked at the rows of covered shapes and the 4 heavy filing cabinets, and the dim shape of the corridor extending beyond. She breathed the cool, still air. She thought about what left in City meant. Then she walked to the nearest covered shape, took a photograph of it before touching anything, and carefully lifted one edge of the canvas. Beneath it was a wooden crate, sealed with steel banding, marked with stenciled numbers and a government agency stamp she didn't immediately recognize. She photographed the markings without removing anything. She moved to the next shape and lifted the canvas from that one too. Another crate, similar markings, different numbers. She moved through the room methodically, lifting canvas edges and replacing them, photographing the markings beneath, writing down every number and stamp she could read. She did not open anything. She documented everything. It took most of the morning. When she came up from the bunker that afternoon, she sat in the weeds and called Francis. She read out the agency stamps she had photographed. She heard Francis become very quiet on the other end of the line. Then Francis asked her to send the photographs. Renata sent them from the gravel turnoff, sitting in the borrowed car with the engine running for warmth, and waited. Francis called back in 20 minutes. Her voice had changed. It was still careful, still measured, but something behind the measurements was different now. She said, "I want you to listen carefully to what I'm going to tell you." She said, "I need you to stay calm and not do anything until we have spoken properly in person." She said, "Some of the designations on those crates correspond to a class of assets that were part of a federal precious metals storage and transfer program that ran from the 1940s through the 1970s. She said the program had involved physical assets including refined gold, silver, platinum group metals, and in some documented cases, numismatic collections and currency reserves that were staged at regional facilities as part of contingency financial infrastructure." Renata sat in the borrowed car on the gravel turnoff in Grover County and stared through the windshield at the flat field and the rusted hatch set into the earth. She said, "Are you telling me what I think you're telling me?" Francis said, "I'm telling you not to open anything and not to tell anyone, and to meet me tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And yes, I think you understand what I am telling you." The shelter was ordinary that evening. Dinner was served at 6, and Cora ate macaroni with the focused enthusiasm. She brought to most food, and the woman at the next table talked about her job interview, and the night duty staff did the 9 o'clock quiet check, and Renata lay in the narrow bed beside her daughter and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the crates in the underground room. She thought about the stenciled numbers and the government stamps and what Francis had said about precious metals and contingency financial infrastructure. She thought about the word millions, which Francis had not said, but which had been present in the silence around everything she did say, waiting to be named. She thought about Cora asking if there would be a yard. She thought about the crow on the fence post, watching them with that sideways professional interest, as if it already knew something they didn't and was patiently waiting for them to catch up. She thought about $800. The last $800. The amount that everyone who knew her situation would have told her to be careful with, to spend sensibly, to stretch as far as it could go. The amount she had spent on a rusted hatch and a concrete staircase going down into darkness. She thought about Cora's voice at the top of those stairs. "Mom, it's so dark in there." And she had gone down anyway. She had taken her daughter's hand and gone down anyway. Because the only thing harder than going into the dark is staying where you are, when staying where you are is its own kind of darkness. She did not sleep much that night. She was at Francis's office at 8:55 the following morning, sitting in a chair across from a woman who had a long career's worth of composure and was currently using every bit of it. Francis had done more research since their call. She laid it out on her desk in printed pages and photographs downloaded from archival sources, and she walked Renata through it point by point with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood that the person across from her needed to understand this fully before anything else happened. The program whose agency stamps appeared on Renata's crates had been established after the war to distribute physical financial reserves to regional facilities in the event that central banking infrastructure was disrupted. The program had operated for decades and had been wound down in stages, with most assets officially recalled and returned through documented transfers. But the documentation, Francis explained, was incomplete. Several regional facilities had reported assets and inventory that were never confirmed as retrieved. This had been noted internally, investigated once in the 1980s, and then filed away when the cost of a full audit exceeded what anyone expected to recover. The facilities were decommissioned. The records stayed incomplete. The assets stayed where they were. Renata asked how much they were talking about. Frances said she didn't know precisely. She said the category of assets that matched what Renata had photographed, based on the designation codes and the volumes visible in the photographs, was consistent with a significant stockpile. She said that in the current market, depending on what was actually in the crates, the range could be substantial. She used the word substantial twice. She did not give a number. She said, "Before we know anything real, we need a professional evaluation." She said, "That means bringing in someone we trust, someone bound by confidentiality, to assess what is actually there without disturbing legal evidence or triggering disclosure requirements prematurely." She said, "I have someone in mind." She said, "Renata, I also need to tell you something else. When this becomes known, and it will become known, there are parties who will argue that these assets were never properly abandoned, that the government retains a claim, that your ownership does not extend to what is inside. Some of those arguments may have merit, some will not. We need to be positioned correctly before that happens." Renata asked what positioned correctly meant. Frances said it meant being the person who had already established clear legal ownership, clear documentation of discovery, and a record of conducting the process responsibly and above board. It meant not being the person who opened a crate in secret and tried to disappear with what was inside. It meant being, from the very first moment, the person who did everything right. Renata said that was the only kind of person she knew how to be. Frances nodded and picked up her phone. The evaluator Frances contacted was a man named Theodore Marsh, who had spent 30 years working in asset assessment for government agencies and private collectors, and who had a reputation that Frances described as absolutely unimpeachable and slightly intimidating in person. He arrived 2 days later in a gray car with no visible identifying markings, carrying 2 cases of equipment and an expression that suggested he had seen many unusual things and been surprised by very few of them. He was surprised by this. He said nothing when they descended the stairs. He moved through the rooms with the careful, deliberate attention of someone reading a document in a language they know very well. He examined the stenciled markings on the crates without touching them. He photographed the filing cabinets. He spent 15 minutes in the communications room looking at the equipment there. When he finally spoke, it was to ask Renata 3 precise questions about the purchase documentation and the property deed, which she answered from memory, having read both documents so many times she could have recited them in her sleep. Then he said he would like to open one crate, with proper witness and documentation, to conduct a preliminary assessment. Frances and Renata both said yes. The crate he selected was one of the mid-sized ones, not the largest, chosen, he explained, because its markings were consistent with the type of asset he could assess quickly and definitively. He removed the steel banding with a tool from his case. He pried the lid with the same care a surgeon brings to an initial incision. He lifted the lid and set it aside and shone his light inside. The crate was packed with straw matting, old and dry but intact. Nestled within the straw, in individual wrapped sections, were bars. Gold-colored metal, each one stamped with markings that Marsh examined one by one. A measuring device brought from his case against one. A light passed across the stamps. A long silence during which he breathed carefully and wrote in his notebook. Then he straightened and turned to look at Renata, and for the first time, his expression changed. Not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man. But something in his eyes shifted, a recalibration, the look of someone adjusting what they had expected to find against what they were actually looking at. He said, "These appear to be refined gold bullion bars consistent with government minting specifications from the mid-20th century." He said, "The stamps and markings are consistent with authentic federal inventory from that era." He said, "Based on this sample, if the remaining crates contain materials of similar type and quantity, I would estimate that a proper full assessment could yield a valuation in the range of several $100 million. The underground room was quiet the way only underground rooms can be quiet. The flashlight beams were steady. The cool air pressed against Renata's face. She said, "Several $100 million. Marsh said, "That is a preliminary estimate based on one open crate. It could be lower. It is unlikely to be lower." Frances put her hand briefly on Renata's arm. Renata stood in the room that she owned, in the ground beneath the field that she owned, 45 minutes from the city, 45 minutes from the shelter where she and her daughter slept in a narrow bed. and she felt the full extraordinary weight of $800. Every cent of it. The last money she had in the world, spent on a hole in the ground that nobody wanted, on a listing with 3 photographs and 17 words and a code to a lockbox that said 1947. She thought about what she had told Cora on the sidewalk outside their building, watching everything they owned being moved to the curb. She had said it was an adventure. She had been right. She had not known how right. She had not known in what way. She had gone down into the dark anyway. She breathed out slowly in the cool, still underground air. Then she turned to Francis and said, "What do we do next? If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." What happened next did not happen quietly, and it did not happen quickly, and the weeks that followed the discovery were among the hardest Renata had ever lived through, which was saying something given the previous 18 months. She had imagined, in some vague way, that finding the thing would be the hard part, that once the thing was found, the rest would follow. She had been wrong about this. The finding was only the beginning of a process that was far more complicated and contested than she had been prepared for. The full assessment took 3 weeks. Theodore Marsh returned with 2 additional colleagues, both with credentials Francis verified with thorough care, and they worked through the storage room systematically, opening each crate in documented sequence, logging contents, assessing condition and provenance, photographing everything against written inventory. Renata was present for every session. Francis was present for every session. A notary Francis retained was present for every session. Everything was witnessed, recorded, and filed. What was in the crates was not uniform. Some held gold bullion, bars of varying sizes, but all bearing consistent government markings from the post-war decades. Others held silver, refined and minted, heavier and more voluminous than the gold, filling more of the crates with a cooler, brighter glint. 2 crates held platinum, smaller in volume, but representing the highest per unit value of anything in the room. Beneath those, in a section of shelving Renata had not fully mapped in her early visits, there was a crate of a different type, wooden, older than the others, its exterior markings different in style. When Marsh opened it, he was quiet for a long time before speaking. Inside were coin trays, old ones, the felt faded but the structure intact, and in the trays were coins. Not circulation coins. Not the worn ordinary currency of everyday use. These were numismatic specimens, rare issues, limited mintages, some of them condition grades that Marsh said had not been seen in open market sale for decades because this quality of preservation did not typically survive uncontrolled storage. They had survived here because the underground conditions had been nearly ideal. Constant cool temperature, no light, no humidity fluctuation, no handling. They had been down here in the dark, perfectly kept, for 60 years. When the final inventory was complete, Marsh sat down with Francis and Renata in the surface light above the hatch, on folding chairs Renata had brought in the back of the borrowed car, and he read through the total assessment. The numbers he listed, category by category, added up to an evaluation of $340 million at current market rates. $340 million. In a bunker she had bought for $800. Renata did not react the way people react in movies. She did not gasp or cry or press her hands to her face. She sat in the folding chair in the weedy field in Grover County and felt the number move through her like a change in the weight of the air, like the moment when the weather shifts and the pressure drops, and everything feels different though nothing visible has changed yet. She thought, Cora will have a yard. She thought, Cora will have whatever she wants. Francis was already explaining the next steps, the legal framework for claiming the assets, the notifications that had to be filed, the expected challenges from federal authorities who would almost certainly dispute the ownership of contents they had not officially transferred. She said, "Be ready for this to get loud. Be ready for people to appear who have opinions about what belongs to you." They appeared the following week. A letter arrived from a government legal office asserting that the contents of the facility were federal property that had never been formally abandoned and remained under federal custody regardless of the surface land sale. The letter was long and precisely worded and clearly written by people who were very good at this particular kind of letter. Francis had expected it. She had prepared for it. Her response was already drafted before the letter arrived, built on the incomplete disposal records, The decommissioning memo that explicitly noted assets left in situ, the decades of private ownership without federal retrieval attempts, and the established legal principles around abandoned property. She filed the response and told Renata to stay calm. Stay calm was not easy, but Renata had been practicing it for a long time. Word began to spread in the days after the legal filings became part of the public record. The county where the property sat was small. The filing was not sealed. A reporter from a regional news outlet found it and published a brief article. Then a larger outlet picked it up. Then another. The story, once it existed, spread with the specific velocity of something that contains all the elements people find impossible to ignore: a homeless woman, a hole in the ground, $800, and a number with 9 digits. People found out. People always find out. And when they found out, they had opinions. Some of the opinions were generous. Messages arrived through channels Renata did not entirely understand. People who had found her name in the articles, people who said they were inspired, people who said she deserved it, people who told their own stories of hardship in letters that she read late at night with a care she gave to everything that came from someone's actual life. She kept those letters. She put them in a folder. Others were less generous. There were people who said she had no legitimate claim, that found treasure was not the same as owned property, that the government was right to contest it. There were people who said it was suspicious that a homeless woman had happened to buy the exact property that contained hundreds of millions in federal assets, as if she had known, as if the whole thing was a scheme. There were people who said the money should go to the public, to causes, to anything other than a single person who had simply been in the right place. And there were people closer to home. Her sister in Ohio called. Her sister, who had not called during the eviction, who had sent 2 brief supportive texts during the shelter months and then grown quiet, called now with an urgency that had a very specific texture. She said she had been worried about Renata. She said the family had been talking. She said she hoped Renata wasn't going to do anything impulsive with whatever money came from all this. She said there was a lot of history the family had, a lot of contributions over the years that might be worth considering. Renata listened. She was very good at listening. She said she would think about it. She did not think about it. A former landlord, the man whose building she had been evicted from, found a way to reach her through a mutual contact and suggested that the eviction had been a mutual difficulty and that perhaps there was room to discuss what Renata might feel she owed in terms of the disruption to his property. He said this in language that was careful enough to avoid sounding like what it was. Renata did not respond. An investment consultant she had never heard of sent a letter through a real estate contact suggesting that she would need professional management of any realized assets, and that his firm was particularly well-positioned to help someone in her unique situation. She forwarded it to Frances. Frances said, "This will keep happening." She said, "The moment there is money, there will be no shortage of people who believe they have a claim on it or a right to a portion of it, or simply that you need their help managing it." She said, "None of them were here before. Not one." That was true. Not one of them had been here before. The legal process moved forward with the slow, deliberate momentum of official things. The government's challenge was substantial but not, as Frances had assessed, insurmountable. The strongest element of Renata's case was the decommissioning memo with its explicit left in situ notation, paired with the absence of any retrieval record and the chain of private ownership that had held the property for over 3 decades without federal intervention. The government could argue that abandonment had not been formal. Frances could argue that inaction for 30 years constituted a constructive relinquishment of any practical claim. It would take time. Frances said, "Be patient." She said, "Do not react publicly." She said, "Let the process work." Renata went back to the shelter. She sat in the narrow bed beside Cora and read to her from the library book and answered her questions and tried to make everything feel as ordinary as it was possible to make it feel when you were the person at the center of a story that had already found its way into headlines. Cora knew something was happening. Children always know something is happening. She did not know the specifics. She knew that her mother had bought a place with a hatch and some rooms underground, and that people were figuring out some things about it, and that it might take a little while. She asked if there would be a yard again. Renata said yes. She said it with a certainty she had not let herself feel before, but now it sat in her chest like something solid and warm, something she did not need to be careful with anymore. "Yes," she said, "there will be a yard." The crow was on the fence post every time she visited the property. She had started to find this funny rather than strange. She brought a granola bar one morning and broke off a piece and put it on the post, and the crow took it and flew to the fence line and ate it, and came back to watch her with the same sideways professional interest as before, as if to say that this was an acceptable arrangement and it would tolerate her presence here. She was beginning to feel the same way about the land, that it was tolerating her presence, getting used to her, deciding whether she was worth the investment. She was beginning to feel, underneath the legal uncertainty and the noise and the people who were suddenly interested in her and her $800, something she had not felt in a long time. She was beginning to feel like she was home. She did not have a house yet. She did not have a resolution yet. She did not have $340 million yet, or any millions, or certainty about what would come. She had a deed and a legal team and a crow and a daughter who trusted her and a hole in the ground full of the kind of thing that changed everything. She had been down in the dark, and she was beginning, carefully, to believe in what she had found there. The letter from the government legal office was 11 pages long. Renata read every one of them. She read them the way she read anything important, slowly and twice, noting the specific language, the careful qualifications, the places where certainty was implied but not stated. She had learned to read this way not in any school or training, but in the years of managing her own finances, her own contracts, her own lease agreements, developing a habit of attention that had served her in the ordinary circumstances of her life and was now serving her in circumstances that were anything but ordinary. The letter asserted several things. It asserted that the facility at the Grover County address had been decommissioned as a structure, but that decommissioning of infrastructure did not constitute abandonment of contents. It asserted that the physical assets identified within the facility had at no point been formally transferred out of federal inventory and therefore remained the legal property of the United States government. It asserted that the current property owner, while holding valid title to the surface land and the physical structure, had no legal claim to materials that had never been part of the property sale. It was politely but precisely worded, in the way of things written by people who are accustomed to winning. Frances had read it before Renata. She had prepared a 20-page response. She walked Renata through it over the phone, point by point, in the methodical way she did everything, her voice even and unhurried, her arguments built layer by layer like a structure intended to hold weight. The decommissioning memo, Frances explained, contained language that was going to be very important. The phrase left in situ did not appear in a casual context. It appeared in a section of the memo specifically addressing asset disposition, in a column marked status, in a row corresponding to the facility at Renata's address. Left in situ was the disposition status. That was not a description of oversight. It was a notation of decision. Someone had assessed the cost of retrieval, compared it to the assessed recovery value, and made a documented decision to leave the materials in place. Frances said, "A decision to leave something in place is not the same as maintaining ownership of it in perpetuity. It is a decision to release it to circumstance. And circumstance, in this case, over 33 years of uninterrupted private land ownership and zero retrieval attempts, constitutes constructive abandonment under well-established legal principles." Renata asked if that would be enough. Frances said, "It is a strong argument. Strong arguments do not always win, but they win more often than weak ones, and this is a strong one." Renata said she understood. She went back to the shelter that evening, made dinner with Cora in the shared kitchen, listened to her daughter explain at length and with great seriousness the plot of the library book she was reading, and then lay awake that night going over the arguments in her head the way she went over everything important, turning them in the dark until she understood their shape completely. What she kept returning to was not the legal argument, which she trusted Frances to carry. What she kept returning to was the 45-minute drive, the gravel turnoff, the rusted hatch, the lockbox with the code 1947. The seller, Douglas Pell, who had inherited the property from his uncle and had no interest in it beyond not wanting to keep paying taxes. The 4 months the listing had sat with no inquiries. The 3 previous owners who had paid their taxes dutifully and done nothing with it. Nobody had wanted it. For 33 years of private ownership, and however long before that of government non-use, nobody had wanted it enough to look inside. She had wanted it. She had spent her last $800 on it. She had gone down into the dark with a flashlight and her 7-year-old daughter, and she had looked. That had to count for something. She did not know yet if it counted in the legal sense. But it counted in the sense that she understood, the sense that had kept her moving through the previous 18 months when every reasonable assessment of her situation would have justified stopping. She was not going to stop. The response Francis filed generated a counter-response. The counter-response generated another filing. The case developed the particular rhythm of legal processes, measured and deliberate, its progress invisible to anyone not trained to read the signs, its outcomes still genuinely uncertain. Renata learned to live alongside this uncertainty without being consumed by it, the way you learn to live alongside anything you cannot control by focusing on what you can. What she could control was the property itself. She began spending more time there. She worked with a local contractor Francis had vetted, a woman named Sable Torres who specialized in structural assessment and had done work on historical properties to evaluate what the surface land and the underground structure would need to become livable. The assessment was detailed and honest. The surface acreage needed clearing and grading. The hatch access needed to be widened and made safe. The underground structure needed ventilation, electrical infrastructure, waterproofing checks, and a thorough review of its existing systems. None of this was impossible. Some of it was expensive. Renata did not have the money yet. The assets were legally contested and inaccessible. But Francis had helped her establish a line of credit against the property itself. The land was clear and legally hers without dispute, and the credit was enough to begin the surface work while the legal process continued. She hired Sable's crew. She watched them work. She asked questions and learned the answers and asked more questions. She spent her days at the property during the work hours and her evenings at the shelter, and she began to feel the distance between those two places not as a gap, but as a trajectory, something she was moving along rather than stuck within. Cora came on weekends. She stood at the edge of the clearing work with Gerald the rabbit and watched the machinery with the solemn, interested attention she gave to things she had decided were important. She explored the perimeter of the property with the thorough geographic curiosity of a child who had been without a yard for too long. She found a stream at the back edge of the two. For acres that Renata had not noticed, small and clear, running along the property line between two stands of old trees. Cora named the stream. She named it Gerald's Creek, after the rabbit. She said this in a tone that did not invite negotiation. Renata said that was a fine name. The crow was still there. Renata had begun to think of it as hers, in the loose, undemanding way you think of wild things that tolerate your presence as yours. It had moved from the fence post to a branch of one of the large oaks near the hatch, and it watched the construction activity with the same sideways professional interest it brought to everything. Cora had named the crow too. She had named it Barbara. She said Barbara looked like a Barbara. Renata could not argue with this. The news coverage did not stop. It ebbed and flowed with the rhythm of the legal filings, each new development generating a new round of articles and commentary, and the particular texture of public attention that arrives when a story contains both ordinary human struggle and extraordinary numbers. Renata was careful about what she said publicly on Francis's advice, which was to say almost nothing. She declined interview requests. She did not post on social media. She did not respond to the opinion pieces, and there were many opinion pieces arguing about whether she deserved what she had found, whether the government's claim was legitimate, whether the story meant something larger about luck and poverty and the randomness of fortune. She let people argue. She had always understood that people arguing about something usually meant they had not found a way to take it from you yet. Her sister called again. This call was different from the first. Her sister did not mention the family history or prior contributions. She said she had been thinking about how hard things had been for Renata and how much she wished she had done more. She said that family was family and she hoped Renata knew that whatever happened, she had people in her corner. She said it warmly and with what sounded like genuine feeling, and Renata listened carefully because genuine feeling was a thing she respected and could not afford to dismiss. She also could not afford to be naive about it. She had learned the difference between genuine feeling and genuine feeling activated by circumstance, and the difference mattered. She said she appreciated it. She meant that. A journalist from a national publication sent a long and carefully written letter, not a media request but a genuine letter, explaining that she was working on a story about government decommissioning programs and what happened to assets left at abandoned facilities, and that Renata's situation was potentially an example of a much larger pattern, Not the only facility in the country where this had happened. Not the only person who might have claims. She said. She was not trying to sensationalize. She said she thought the story was about something real and important. She said she would understand if Renata did not want to participate, but that she wanted her to know the offer was there. Renata read the letter 3 times. She forwarded it to Frances. Frances said she was careful but not dismissive. She said there might be a moment for this, but not yet. Renata wrote back to the journalist and said, not yet. But she saved the letter. What she did not do, through all of it, was doubt the decision. She had made the decision on a Tuesday morning in the common room of a shelter with $800 and a 7-year-old daughter and a listing with 3 photographs and 17 words. She had made it in the particular way she made all her important decisions, not from certainty, but from the stubborn refusal to let the absence of certainty stop her. Doubt was a luxury she had learned to work alongside rather than be governed by. She had gone down into the dark. She had found what she found. She was going to see it through. The weeks continued. The legal filings continued. Sable's crew cleared the surface, graded the access, reinforced the hatch surround with new concrete, and a proper door that opened smoothly and sealed tightly. Electricians began running lines into the underground space from a generator set above, the first real power the structure had seen in decades. The underground rooms, when lit for the first time by actual electrical light rather than flashlight beams, looked different. Larger, more purposeful. The organization of the shelving, the arrangement of the crates, the layout of the corridor became more legible, more obviously deliberate. This had been a serious place, built and maintained by serious people for purposes they considered genuinely important. It still felt serious. It felt like something that had been waiting with patience and intention for someone to understand what it was. Marsh visited again during this period, twice. His visits were not assessments this time, but consultations. He was helping Frances build the evidentiary record for the legal case, documenting the condition and provenance of the materials with the specific technical detail that expert testimony required. He was thorough and unhurried. He treated the space with a respect that Renata noticed and appreciated, the way you notice and appreciate when someone treats something you care about with the care it deserves. On his second visit, as they were walking out, he paused at the base of the stairs and looked back down the corridor. He said, "In 30 years, I have assessed a lot of collections. I have seen things in extraordinary condition and things in devastating condition and everything between." He paused. He said, "The condition of the numismatic material in particular is among the finest preservation I have encountered." He said it as a fact, without embellishment, but there was something underneath the fact, a quiet acknowledgement of something rare. Renata asked why. He said, "Because most things don't survive being forgotten. Things that survive being forgotten usually had something protecting them, something the people who left them behind either planned for or were lucky enough to have in place." He looked at the corridor. He said, "Whoever built this place and whoever put those materials here understood something about duration, about making things last." Renata thought about that for a while after he left. About making things last. About duration. About the things that survive being forgotten and the things that don't. She thought about the farm in the first story she had heard as a child, the kind of story about endurance that her grandmother used to tell, about people who held on past the point when holding on made sense, past the point when everyone else had let go, and found something on the other side of that holding. She had always believed in those stories not because they were guaranteed to be true, but because they described a real thing, a thing she recognized, the stubborn insistence on continuing when continuation seemed irrational. She had been continuing for 18 months. She had been continuing her whole adult life, in the way that people who do not have the option to stop learn to continue. She was still continuing. She was going to keep continuing until there was nothing left to continue toward, and from where she stood right now, there was a great deal left. The first breakthrough in the legal case came on a Thursday afternoon, arriving not as a dramatic ruling, but as a phone call from Frances that Renata took while sitting on the tailgate of Sable's truck, watching a crew member finish work on the new access door. Frances said, "I have something." She had found, in a database of federal administrative records that she had been searching for 3 weeks, a document that had not appeared in any of the earlier research. It was a second decommissioning memo, later than the first, specific to the asset disposition process for the category of facilities that included Renata's address. This memo, dated 1993, contained language that went further than the 1991 document. It explicitly stated that materials remaining at listed facilities following the closure date were to be considered disposed of under the relevant federal surplus property statutes, and that no retrieval claim could be filed against private property owners for materials discovered subsequent to the closure date. Francis said, "This is not ambiguous. It is explicit disposal language under the surplus property statutes. It means that the government itself, in 1993, declared these materials disposed of. They cannot now argue that they maintain ownership of something they formally declared disposed." Renata sat on the tailgate and looked at the new access door, solid and well-fitted, opening smoothly into the ground she owned. She said, "So they disposed of it to themselves and forgot to pick it up." Francis laughed, which was a thing she rarely did. She said, "That is not inaccurate." She said, "This is very good news." It was very good news. It was not the end of the legal process, because nothing in the legal process ended quickly, but it was the moment the case changed shape. Francis filed the new document with a detailed legal brief explaining its significance, and the government's legal team requested additional time to respond, which was a response that legal teams made when they needed time to reassess. Word got out, as it always did, and the coverage shifted. The articles that had been balanced between Renata's claim and the government's moved towards something different, something that acknowledged what the 1993 memo meant for the contest of ownership. The opinion pieces changed too. Not all of them, but enough to indicate that the weight of public understanding was redistributing. Her sister called. Her sister said she had been reading about it and was so proud of her. She said the way Renata had handled herself through all of this was remarkable. She said she hoped they could get together soon, she and Renata and Cora, and really reconnect. She said it with warmth that was real and with an underlying current that Renata understood completely and did not hold against her, because it was human, and her sister was human, and people showed up when the odds improved. That was just the way of things. Renata said she would love to get together soon. She meant it. She did not mean it in the way her sister hoped she meant it, but she meant it genuinely, because there was a kind of peace that came with being on the right side of things, with having something that was truly yours, that made you feel less guarded rather than more. She was not going to be generous with money to people who had not been there, but she could be generous with time and presence and the kind of ordinary family connection that had nothing to do with money. She was beginning to understand the difference between the two kinds of generosity, and which one she had always had to offer, and which one people had always wanted from her. The contractor who had sold the property to the previous owner, a man from 2 counties over who had attempted to develop the site in the late 90s and failed, appeared through a mutual contact with a suggestion that his earlier investment in survey work and environmental clearance had contributed to the property's value and ought to be compensated. He had never met Renata. He had no legal claim. He had a lawyer who had drafted a letter that used the word unjust enrichment twice. Francis disposed of this in a response that took 2 paragraphs. A woman in an online forum who had taken an interest in the story posted a long and passionate argument that the coins and precious metals in the bunker were the cultural heritage of the American people and should be donated to a museum or public trust rather than retained by an individual. This argument was picked up by several outlets and generated a debate that was lively and sincere and had no bearing on the legal reality. Renata read the debate with the same careful attention she gave to everything and found it interesting as a question of values and genuinely irrelevant to what she was doing, which was following a legal process that Francis had constructed with considerable skill. The former property owner before the previous one, an elderly man who had held the title for 8 years in the 80s and done nothing with it, was contacted by someone Renata never identified and produced an affidavit suggesting that he had always intended to explore the underground structure but had been prevented by health circumstances. Francis said this was interesting as a human document and meaningless as a legal one. Renata kept a mental list of the people who appeared when the story became public, a list not of grievances but of data points, information about the way the world worked that she found useful to understand clearly. The information was not surprising. It confirmed things she had already suspected about what happened when the invisible became visible, when the person whom nobody had noticed became someone that everyone suddenly had an opinion about or a claim on or a story involving. She had been invisible for long enough to know the value of it. She had been visible for long enough now to know the cost. She navigated both with the same steady attention she brought to everything. She did not react publicly. She did not perform either gratitude or defiance for the audience that had assembled around her story. She went to the property and watched the work and asked questions and learned things and talked to Sable about what would come next, structurally, practically, in terms of making the underground space into something that could actually be used. She talked to Cora about what kind of room she wanted, what color, what kind of bed, whether she wanted to be underground or in a structure built on the surface land, whether she wanted a window that looked toward Gerald's Creek. Cora said she wanted to be underground. She said it was cool down there and quiet, and it felt like being inside something safe. Renata understood this completely. She asked Cora if she wanted the walls to be any particular color. Cora said yellow. She said Gerald the rabbit liked yellow. Renata said yellow it was. She stood in the main corridor of the underground space one afternoon in the new electrical light, looking at the concrete walls and the steel shelving and the rows of documented crates, and she tried to hold both things at once. What this had been and what it was going to be. It had been a contingency, a precaution, a thing built in the expectation of a catastrophe that never came. It had sat sealed and dark and patient for decades, its contents perfectly preserved, waiting for something it was not capable of specifying, just waiting. Now it was hers. It was going to be a home. Not the whole of it, not the storage rooms full of crates, not the communications chamber or the filing room, but the corridor, the side rooms, the spaces that she and Sable and the electrical crew were learning could be made warm and livable without losing the quality of shelter that was inherent to the space. Underground did not have to mean grim. Underground, with proper light and ventilation and the particular silence that existed 45 feet below the surface of a Grover County field, could mean something very different. Something that a 7-year-old who had slept in a shelter for 3 months and asked every day if there would be a yard might find to be exactly the right place. The legal resolution, when it came, did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrived the way Francis had said it would, incrementally, through a series of filings and responses and orders that individually meant little but collectively constituted the shape of an outcome. The government's legal team, faced with the 1993 surplus property memo and the sustained argumentation Francis had built around it, withdrew the primary ownership claim. They retained a secondary argument about record-keeping obligations, which was resolved through an agreement that Renata would provide full documentation of the assets to the relevant federal archive, which Theodore Marsh had already prepared. That agreement cost her nothing she had not already done and conceded nothing material about ownership. She owned it. She owned all of it. Francis called her on a Wednesday afternoon and said, "It's done." She said it the same way she said everything, evenly, without excess, the statement sitting in its own space without decoration. She said, "You own the assets at the property in Grover County, free and clear of any federal claim." She said, "We should meet to discuss next steps regarding the realization process." Renata was at the property when the call came. She was standing near the access door, watching Barbara the Crow move along the oak branch with that sideways professional attention, and she felt the news arrive in her body before she had fully processed it in her mind. A shift in the air, a loosening of something that had been held tight for a very long time. She thanked Francis. She said she would see her Thursday. She ended the call and stood in the field in the flat afternoon light and breathed. She thought about the eviction. She thought about the sidewalk and the truck and the man with the clipboard and Cora asking if they were going on a trip. She thought about the shelter ceiling and the common room computer and the listing with 3 photographs and 17 words. She thought about the lockbox code, 1947, and the key that was heavy and old and made to last. She thought about the steps going down into darkness and her daughter's voice. "Mom, it's so dark in there." She had gone down anyway. And now she was standing in a field she owned, above a space she owned, above $340 million that she owned, in the flat afternoon light of a Wednesday in Grover County, with a crow on a branch watching her, and a creek named after a stuffed rabbit at the back of the property, and yellow paint waiting to be chosen for a room that a 7-year-old had decided she wanted underground, because it felt like being inside something safe. She bent down and picked up a handful of the field soil. It was dry and light, the way field soil was in the autumn. She held it in her palm and felt its weight, which was negligible, which was almost nothing, which was the weight of the beginning of everything. She let it go. The wind took it. She walked toward the access door and went down into her home. The realization process, as Frances called it, was the practical work of converting assessed value into actual accessible resources, and it was more complicated and slower than the word realization suggested. The assets had to be transported from the facility under secure conditions, assessed by certified buyers, sold or placed through appropriate markets, with proceeds managed through accounts Frances helped establish and a financial advisor she vetted with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. The gold went first to a sovereign metals buyer with the necessary certifications, sold over several months in portions that maximized price without disrupting the market. The silver followed on a similar schedule. The platinum was sold through a specialist dealer Marsh recommended. The numismatic collection was the most complex and the most potentially valuable, requiring individual authentication for each specimen, grading, and placement through auction houses with the appropriate expertise and clientele. The money arrived in waves rather than all at once, which Frances had explained would happen and which turned out to be practically useful. Each wave was real and usable and transformative in its own right, and the full sum accumulated over the months of the realization process, growing in the accounts that were now genuinely hers, in numbers she checked sometimes in the evenings with a disbelief that never entirely resolved into normalcy, no matter how many times she looked at them. $340 million. Minus taxes, minus Frances's fees, minus the various costs of the realization process, minus the construction work on the property. Still a number with 9 digits. Still a number that represented the permanent end of a certain kind of fear, the specific fear of running out, the fear she had lived with for so long that its absence felt physically strange, like a sound that stops and leaves the room differently shaped. She spent the first available money on the property. She finished the underground renovation, yellow room and all, and began construction of a small surface structure, a proper house. Nothing extravagant, for rooms and a porch and windows that looked toward Gerald's Creek. She paid off the line of credit Frances had helped her establish. She paid Sable's crew in full with a bonus that made Sable stop and look at her for a moment before she smiled and said she appreciated it. She looked at the shelter. She called the director, a woman named Iris who had given Renata and Cora a room in the first week and had never once made her feel like a number. She made a donation that was large enough to fund the shelter's operating costs for 5 years and to renovate the common room and replace the shared kitchen equipment. And she did it anonymously at first, and then, after Iris called her in tears asking who had done this, she admitted it, because there was no reason not to and because Iris deserved to know. Iris said, "Renata." She said it twice. Then she said, "You didn't have to do this." Renata said, "I know." She said, "That's why I did it." She thought about all the things that had been done for her in the margins of the previous 18 months, the small, unremarked courtesies, the woman who lent her the car without asking too many questions, the man at the shelter who had told her about the community legal clinic where she met Frances herself, who had taken a call from a stranger and followed it with 2 decades worth of accumulated legal expertise and genuine engagement. She thought about all the ways that survival is a collective process even when it looks like an individual one, the invisible infrastructure of small helps and offered hands that holds people up when the official systems fail. She thought about the farmer in the story her grandmother used to tell, the one who held on, the one who refused to let go of what was his, not because he was certain it would work out, but because he was certain that letting go would mean losing the possibility of it working out. He had been right. Not because stubbornness is always rewarded, but because some things require staying in order to be found. She had stayed. She had gone down into the dark. She had found $340 million in a hole in the ground that nobody wanted. She had fought for it through weeks of legal challenge and public attention and the various claims of people who had not been there and now wanted to be. She had done it with a 7-year-old daughter and $800 and a crow named Barbara and a rabbit named Gerald and an attorney who laughed exactly once in the entire process and meant it when she did. She sat on the porch of the new surface house one evening, the construction mostly done, and looked out over the field as the sun dropped. The hatch cover was visible from here, newer and cleaner than when she had first found it, a proper door now rather than a rusted lid, fitted with a lock she had chosen herself. Beyond it, the oak where Barbara perched. Beyond that, the fence line, and behind it the stand of trees along Gerald's creek. Cora came out and sat beside her, still carrying Gerald the rabbit, which she carried everywhere still, though less from habit now and more from affection. She had made friends at the new school, found 3 weeks earlier, closer to the property than the city was. She had a teacher she liked. She had discovered that the stream held small fish and had developed an interest in them that was serious and specific in the way of her interest generally. She sat beside her mother and looked at the field. She said, "It turned out okay." Renata looked at her daughter. She thought about the sidewalk, the truck, the man with the clipboard, Gerald the rabbit under Cora's arm. The question asked with complete trust, the complete trust of a child who believes her mother will make sense of whatever is happening. She said, "It turned out okay." Cora said, "I like it here." Renata said, "I like it here too." The crow moved on the oak branch. The light went golden and then orange across the field. The stream at the back of the property made a sound too quiet to hear, but present enough to feel, the particular texture of moving water in a still evening. Renata thought about what the next months would bring. The financial advisors' meetings. The decisions about what to do with the resources she now had, how to direct them, what to build, what to contribute to, what to keep and what to give. She had ideas. She had been forming them carefully, in the way she formed everything carefully, without rushing, without letting the size of the number make the decisions for her. She thought about the journalist who had written the careful letter, "Not yet." She thought about the moment that not yet would become now. She thought about what Francis had said, early in the process, about being positioned correctly, about being the person who did everything right, about the difference between the person who opens a crate in secret and the person who does it with witnesses and documentation, and the full patience of someone who understands that doing things correctly is not a disadvantage. It is the only real advantage. She had done it correctly. She had done it slowly and carefully and with full attention to every step. And it had worked. Not because careful people always. 1. Not because the universe rewarded patience, but because she had built something solid enough to hold up when it was challenged, and it had been challenged, and it had held. She looked at the hatch cover in the fading light. $340 million. In a hole in the ground. Under a field that nobody wanted. Bought for $800 by a woman with nothing left. The world was full of things that nobody wanted until someone looked. Full of things that seemed worthless until someone asked a different question. Full of closed doors that led to rooms that nobody had checked. Full of hatches in overgrown fields with lockboxes coded 1947, waiting for someone stubborn and desperate and clear-eyed enough to open them. She had been all of those things. She still was. The money didn't change that. The money was the consequence of those things, not their replacement. She was still the woman who had gone down into the dark. She was always going to be that woman. And from here, from this porch, looking out over this field in this particular fading light, she understood that this was not a limitation. It was everything. The financial advisor Francis had vetted was a man named Gerald Osei, which made Cora laugh when she heard his name, because she said there were now 2 Geralds on the property, and one of them was a rabbit. Gerald Osei did not appear to mind being compared to a rabbit. He was a calm, methodical man in his early 50s who had spent his career working with people who had come into large sums of money through inheritance or settlement or the particular lottery of circumstance, and he had learned in that career that the most dangerous thing large sums of money could do to a person was make them feel like they had to move fast. He told Renata this in their first meeting, sitting across a table in Francis's office with a notepad and a quietly commanding patience. He said, "The impulse when resources arrive suddenly is to act on them immediately, to treat urgency as a form of respect for the money." He said, "That impulse is almost always wrong." He said, "Money that has waited 60 years in a concrete room underground can afford to wait another 6 months while you decide what it is for." Renata said she had already given that some thought. He said he suspected she had, and that was one of the reasons Francis had recommended her to him rather than the other way around. She liked him. She liked the way he spoke about money as something to be understood rather than something to be impressed by, the way he treated the numbers not as the point of the conversation, but as the context for a different and more important conversation about intention and duration and what she actually wanted her life to look like in 5 years and 10 years and 20. She had answers to those questions. She had been forming them for months, in the way she formed everything, carefully and in the dark, turning them over until they had a shape she could trust. She wanted Cora to have everything she needed and the specific freedom that came from knowing the floor would not give way beneath her. Not extravagance. Not the kind of wealth that insulated a child from reality in ways that made reality harder to navigate later. Just the floor. Just the certainty that there was a floor. She had grown up with that certainty and then lost it and then found it again in the most improbable way imaginable, and she understood its value more precisely now than she ever had before. She wanted the property to be finished properly, not grandly. The surface house was almost done, and it was modest and well-built and had a porch that faced the field and windows that looked toward Gerald's Creek, and it was exactly the right size for 2 people and a rabbit, and occasionally a crow who felt entitled to sit on the railing uninvited. She wanted to do something with the underground space that was larger than a home. She had been thinking about this for months, and the shape of it was becoming clearer. The structure was extraordinary, not just in what it had contained, but in what it was. A space built for duration, for the preservation of things that mattered, for the long, quiet work of keeping something intact through circumstances that could not be anticipated. She had come to feel that this was a purpose worth continuing rather than converting. The space had been built by people who understood that some things required shelter and patience and the willingness to hold something carefully for as long as it took. She understood that too. She wanted to use it that way. She told Gerald O'Say what she was thinking. He listened without interrupting. Then he nodded and said, "That is a purpose that can be built sustainably." He said, "Tell me more about what it would look like." She told him. The months after the legal resolution were months of construction in multiple senses simultaneously. The surface house was finished in early spring, and they moved in on a Saturday that was cold and bright, with a sky the particular blue that arrives after a long winter has finally committed to leaving. Cora carried Gerald the rabbit in one arm and a box of books in the other, and walked through the front door of their house with the specific gravity of someone taking possession of something long anticipated. She walked through every room. She examined the windows. She opened and closed the kitchen cabinets with the methodical attention of an inspector. She went down the corridor to her room, which had been painted yellow, a warm and particular yellow that caught the morning light through the east-facing window and held it in a way that made the room feel lit from the inside. She stood in the middle of her room for a long moment. Then she put Gerald the rabbit on the bed and turned and said, "This is good." Renata stood in the doorway and felt something in her chest that she did not try to name because it was too large for names, too specific to the shape of the previous 2 years, too particular to the exact distance between the narrow shelter bed and this yellow room on a cold, bright Saturday in March. She said, "I think so too." The underground renovation continued through the spring. Renata had been specific with Sable's crew about what she wanted and what she didn't. She did not want the space converted in a way that erased what it had been. The bones of the original structure were to remain visible, the concrete walls and steel framing and the functional geometry of a space designed for serious purpose. What she was adding was light and warmth and the infrastructure for the particular kind of use she had in mind, which required preservation quality climate control, secure storage systems, and spaces configured for careful, concentrated work. What she was building, in the rooms that had held the crates and the filing cabinets and the communications array, was an archive. Not a museum exactly, though it would have elements of that. Not a library in the conventional sense, though it would hold materials that belonged in libraries. What she was building was a place for things that needed to be kept, things that were at risk of being lost, things that mattered and had no guaranteed home. She had been in conversation with a preservation specialist, a woman who worked with at-risk historical collections, and with a records archivist who had spent a career fighting to keep documents from disappearing into bureaucratic gaps. Both of them had said, in different words and with different kinds of expertise, that there was a genuine need for what she was describing, that the world was full of things that should be preserved and had nowhere to go. She had plenty of somewhere. She had 60 feet of underground space built for exactly this kind of endurance. The filing cabinets, which had been locked and documented and carefully preserved through the whole process, were finally opened in the spring, with Marsh present and a records specialist Francis had retained. They contained, as it turned out, the original operational documentation for the facility itself, engineering drawings, maintenance logs, inventory records, administrative correspondence. A complete historical record of the building and what had been in it, dating from the early 1950s to the closure in 1991. The documentation was extraordinary, not financially, not like the assets, but in the way of things that filled gaps in the record of how the world has actually worked. The records specialist spent 3 days with them and kept saying, quietly and to herself, that this was remarkable. Renata donated the operational records to the County Historical Society, whose director called her twice to express gratitude and once more just to ask if she understood what she had given them. She said she did. She said she hoped they would make them accessible. The director said absolutely, without hesitation, and Renata could hear the genuine delight in it, the particular happiness of someone who loves a thing and has just been given more of it than they expected. The journalist who had written the careful letter had been patient. Renata had kept the letter in a folder for 7 months. In April, she called the number at the bottom of it. The journalist's name was Mara Voss. She answered on the second ring and said she had hoped to hear from Renata and had not been sure she would. Renata said she had needed time to understand the whole shape of things before she was ready to talk about them, and Mara said she understood that completely and that the wait had been worth it. They met at the property on a Thursday. Mara came with a recorder and a notebook and no camera crew, because Renata had said no cameras yet, and Mara had respected this without discussion. They sat on the porch and talked for 4 hours. Renata told the story from the beginning, from the eviction and the shelter and the computer in the common room, through the listing and the phone call with Douglas Pell and the first descent with Cora into the dark. She told it plainly and in order, the way she thought about everything, without embellishment, without performing any particular version of herself. Mara listened with the concentrated attention of someone who had done this for a long time and still genuinely cared about what she heard. She asked good questions, precise and non-leading, the kind of questions that opened space rather than filled it. She asked about the legal process. She asked about the people who had appeared with claims and opinions. She asked what it had felt like to be in the shelter knowing what was in the ground 45 minutes away while the legal challenge proceeded. Renata said, "It felt like carrying something very heavy through a room you weren't allowed to put it down in." She said, "You learn to adjust your balance." Mara wrote that down. She asked about what Renata was building with the underground space. Renata told her, in the same plain way she had told Gerald O'Say, describing the archive, the preservation work, the particular gap she was trying to fill. Mara was quiet for a moment after this, and then said, "You know, that's the part of the story that I think people are going to find the most surprising. Not the money." Renata asked why. Mara said, "Because it means the place is still doing what it was built to do. It's still keeping things safe." She paused. She said, "Most stories about people who find a lot of money end with the money being the point. This one seems like the money is what made the point possible." Renata said she thought that was exactly right. The piece Mara published ran in a national magazine in May. It was long and carefully written, exactly what her letter had promised. It told the story with the thoroughness it deserved and the precision that the legal and financial details required. But it told it as a human story, not as a news story, not as a lesson or a parable or a symbol of anything beyond what it actually was. A woman who had very little, saw something that everyone else had overlooked, went toward it instead of away from it, and found that it was what she thought it might be. The response was significant. Renata had expected this, had been prepared by Francis and Mara both for the wave of attention that followed a major piece, but the specific texture of the response was different from what the earlier coverage had generated. The earlier coverage had been reactive, people arguing about ownership and luck and whether she deserved it. This coverage generated something quieter and more lasting. Letters came, real letters, the kind sent on paper, from people who had read the piece and wanted to say something about it that they felt required the weight of paper. She read every one. She kept them all in a folder that was growing thick. Many of them were from people who had their own $800 moment, their own decision made from the edge of nothing, their own hole in the ground that everyone else had walked past. Not literally, but the structure of the experience, the decision made without guarantee at the moment of maximum vulnerability, the decision to go towards something instead of away from it. This resonated with people who had faced their own version of it. Some of them had found what they were looking for. Some had not. All of them wrote as if putting the experience into words required an audience that would understand it. She understood it. She wrote back to as many of the letters as she could. Not quickly, not with a form response, but actually wrote back, actually answered what they had said, because they had taken the time to write to her as a real person, and they deserved to be written to as real people in return. This took time. She gave it the time. The summer arrived warm and generous, the kind of summer that made Grover County look like a painting of itself, all long golden light, and the smell of cut grass, and the creek at the back of the property running clear and quick over the stones. Cora had spent 2 weekends arranging into what she described as a fish habitat improvement project. The fish, she reported, seemed to approve. Barbara the Crow had, at some point in the spring, brought a companion. The companion was smaller and watched the property from a different branch of the oak, slightly less confident in its right to be there, but learning quickly. Cora named the companion Beatrice. She said Barbara and Beatrice sounded right together. Renata agreed that they did. The archive opened that summer, quietly, without ceremony, because Renata had decided against ceremony on the grounds that the space had been doing its work without ceremony for 60 years and did not require it now. The opening was a working day. The preservation specialist, whose name was Dr. Anita Chukwu, arrived with her first collection of at-risk materials, a set of documents from a closing regional archive that had nowhere to put them. They were brought down the new wide staircase, past the concrete walls and the steel framing, into the climate-controlled rooms that had been configured for exactly this purpose, and placed with care on the new shelving alongside the engineering drawings and the maintenance logs of the facility itself. Dr. Chukwu stood in the main archive room for a moment, looking at the space. She said, "You know what I keep thinking?" Renata asked what. She said, "I keep thinking about all the things that didn't survive. All the things that needed a place exactly like this and didn't have one." She looked at the ceiling, at the walls, at the evident solidity of the structure. She said, "This is going to matter. Not in the way the money matters. In the other way." Renata said she knew. She did know. She had known it the first time she walked through the space with a flashlight and felt its quality of deliberate endurance, its built-in tension to outlast whatever came. The money had been extraordinary, had changed everything about the material shape of her life, had given Cora the floor, had given Renata the ability to do the things she had in mind without having to choose between them. But the money was also, in a sense, the most temporary thing about the whole story. Money moved, shifted, spent itself in the service of purposes, became other things. The space itself, the underground archive, the concrete and steel built by people who understood duration, that was going to be there long after the money had been converted into everything she intended to convert it into. She thought about what Marsh had said, that most things don't survive being forgotten, that the things that survive being forgotten usually had something protecting them. She thought about the quality of that protection, the specific intelligence embedded in a structure that had kept gold and silver and rare coins in perfect condition for 6 decades while everything around it changed, while governments shifted their priorities and properties changed hands, and the world outside reorganized itself repeatedly around new urgencies. She was going to use that protection for things that deserved it. She was going to use this place as it had been built to be used, with patience and intention and the understanding that some things required shelter for longer than any one person could plan for. Frances visited the archive that summer. She came on a Wednesday, driving herself in the same careful, unhurried way she did everything, parking on the gravel and walking across the field toward the hatch the way Renata had walked toward it on that first Tuesday morning. She went down the new stairs, which were wide and well lit, with a railing of finished steel that caught the light in a way the old concrete steps never had. She walked through the archive rooms, reading the labels on the new shelving, looking at Dr. Chukwu's first collection of documents in their protective housings, running her eyes across the climate control panels with the same professional attentiveness she brought to legal documents. When she came back up, she stood on the surface in the summer light and said, "This is not what I expected." Renata asked what she had expected. Frances considered. She said, "I'm not sure. Something more personal, perhaps. Something that looked more like a monument to what happened here." She gestured at the field, at the surface house, at the oak where Barbara and Beatrice were currently engaged in a dispute of some kind that involved a great deal of movement and noise. She said, "This looks more like something that's going somewhere." Renata said, "That's the idea." Frances said, "You know, In my career, I have helped a lot of people through processes of this kind. People who found things, inherited things, won things, were given things unexpectedly. She paused. She said, "The ones who do well with it are the ones who decide what it is for before they decide what to do with it." She looked at Renata with the directness she always used, the particular look of someone who said exactly what they meant. She said, "You did that." Renata said she had had a lot of time to think. Francis said, "Everyone has time to think. Not everyone uses it for this." She stayed for dinner. Cora made pasta, which she had been learning to cook with the same focused seriousness she brought to fish habitat improvement, and they ate at the kitchen table with the windows open to the summer evening, and Gerald the rabbit sitting near the back door watching the garden with the vigilant interest of a rabbit who had decided the garden was his domain. Francis ate the pasta and said it was excellent, and Cora explained in detail the specific technique she had used to cook the sauce, and Francis listened with genuine attention, and it was one of the ordinary evenings that Renata had learned to notice for what they were. She noticed it. She was always going to notice this kind of evening now, with a precision she had earned by going long enough without it. The school year began. Cora settled into second grade with the ease of a child who had learned to adapt and was now, for the first time in a long time, in conditions that rewarded rather than required that adaptation. She was making friends, real ones, the kind with names Renata heard repeatedly and recognized as belonging to specific children with specific personalities, not the interchangeable acquaintances of a child who moved too often to go deep. She was reading books that were slightly too advanced for her grade level and discussing them with the focused authority of someone who had decided reading was important and saw no reason to be modest about it. She was happy, not loudly, not performatively, just quietly and durably happy. The way children are happy when they feel safe, when the floor has been there long enough that they have stopped checking for it, when they have room to be curious about the world rather than vigilant about it. Renata watched her daughter be happy and felt the full accumulated weight of everything it had taken to get here. Every month of the shelter and the borrowed car and the legal filings and the people who appeared with claims and the people who doubted her and the long quiet nights of going over the arguments in her head until their shape was solid. She felt all of it, and she let it settle, not as something to be proud of exactly, not as something to perform, but as something to know clearly. She knew what it had cost. She knew what it was worth. Both things were true simultaneously, and she held them both. The autumn brought the first external collections to the archive beyond Dr. Chukwu's initial deposit. A small historical society in an adjacent county was closing due to funding cuts and had a collection of local records and photographs with no place to go. They came to Renata through Chukwu, who had put the word out carefully among the preservation community. Renata accepted the collection. A retired archivist who had heard about the project through Mara's article offered to catalog it as a volunteer. He showed up on a Tuesday morning with a notebook and a thermos of coffee in a manner that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this kind of project and was very glad it existed. She hired him, not as a volunteer, as a proper archivist, paid properly, because the work was real and the resources to support it existed, and there was no reason to ask people to donate labor to something that could afford to pay for it. He brought 2 colleagues within a month. The archive was beginning to have a staff, which was a thing Renata had not fully anticipated but which made immediate sense once it happened. A place doing serious work needed people committed to doing it. She expanded the staffing budget. She worked with Gerald Osei on the financial structure that would make the archive self-sustaining over the long term, the endowment model and the grant structures and the categories of collections it would accept, building the financial architecture for something intended to outlast her. She thought about outlasting, about duration, about what it meant to build something that was supposed to continue past the person who built it. This was a different kind of thinking from any she had done before, longer and less personal, planning for her own obsolescence as a prerequisite for the thing's survival. She talked to Cora about it one evening, not in the specific financial terms, but in the shape of it. She said, "I'm building something that's supposed to keep going after us." She said, "I want you to understand that as you get older, so that if you want to be part of it someday, you understand what it is." Cora was doing homework at the kitchen table while this conversation happened, and she had the particular focused peripheral attention that children use when they are listening to something they consider important but do not want to visibly divert from their work. She did not look up. She said, Is it like a library? Renata said, something like that. More for things that don't have anywhere to go. Cora said, like us before. She said it without drama, without any particular weight, the way children name truths they have absorbed and understood and decided to carry quietly. She said it and went back to her homework. Renata sat with that for a long time. Yes, she thought. Like us before. Before the hatch and the lockbox and the code that was 1947, the year her grandmother had been born, she had thought once. Not that it meant anything, but she had thought it. Before Francis and Marsh and Gerald Osei and Sable and Dr. Chuckwu and the retired archivist with his thermos of coffee. Before all of it. Like us before. Things that mattered and had nowhere to go. Now they had somewhere. Now they had 60 feet of underground space built by people who understood duration, staffed by people who understood preservation, funded by $340 million that had waited in the dark for someone to come and find it, to go down into it instead of staying above. The winter came slowly and then all at once, the way winters did in this part of the country, and the field went quiet and gray, and the creek ran slower under a skin of ice at its edges, and Barbara and Beatrice spent more time in the oak than on the fence line, and Gerald the rabbit spent more time indoors, which suited him fine. Renata spent the winter working on the archive's acquisitions policy, the formal framework for what it would accept and what it would not, the criteria for prioritizing collections in genuine need, the process for assessment and intake and cataloging. She worked on it with Chuckwu and the archivist, who had turned out to be one of the most practically useful people she had ever encountered, the kind of person who knew exactly how things should work and had no patience for how they usually did. She worked on the endowment structure with Gerald Osei, building the financial model that would allow the archive to operate independently of her personal involvement over time, to survive the inevitable changes of circumstance that any living project had to be designed to survive. She was thinking about 30 years. She was thinking about 60. She was thinking about the same duration the building had already demonstrated it could sustain. She found this kind of thinking surprisingly natural. She had always planned in the long term, even when the long term was uncertain, even when the immediate term was the shelter ceiling. There was something in her that was oriented toward duration, toward the making of things that lasted, that was stronger than the immediate conditions she found herself in. That orientation had carried her to the hatch. It was going to carry whatever she built beyond herself. She thought about the farmer from the stories her grandmother told, about the quality of that stubbornness, that refusal to equate impossibility with truth, that particular insistence on staying when staying looked like foolishness. She thought about Tom Reeves and his father's ship in the field, built for a dream and then used for survival, lifted by the very disaster everyone had mocked it for anticipating. The things that people laughed at because they could not imagine the use of them, the things that waited patiently to show their purpose, the things that were more than they appeared. The hatch had been more than it appeared. She had been more than she appeared. She sat in the archive on a January afternoon, in the room where the original engineering drawings were housed, and looked at the plans of the building she was sitting inside. She could read them now with a familiarity she had developed over months of living alongside the space, of understanding its geometry from the inside. She could see in the drawings the thinking of the people who had built this, the consideration of pressure and temperature and access and duration, the intelligence embedded in the structure by people who expected it to be needed under conditions they could not fully anticipate. She felt, looking at those drawings, a kinship with the builders that she had not expected to feel. They had not known her. They had not built this for her. They had built it for a contingency that never came, a disaster that passed them by. And then they had left it, and 30 years later she had bought it for $800 and gone down into it with her daughter and a flashlight and found what they had left. But the intention, the fundamental intention of building something to last, to shelter what mattered through circumstances that could not be controlled, that intention she shared completely. That was what she was continuing. Not the original purpose, which was gone, but the quality of the purpose, the long-sightedness of it, the understanding that some things required a structure designed not for the present moment, but for the long duration. She was building the long duration. Spring came again. The creek unfroze and ran. Quick and clear, and the fish returned to Cora's habitat improvement area, which Cora inspected and approved with a satisfaction that suggested she had expected nothing less. Barbara and Beatrice's territorial disputes with each other and with various other birds became the ambient background of mornings on the property. The surface garden, which Renata had started the previous year and maintained through the winter with a care that surprised her given how little horticultural experience she had, came back greener and fuller than before. She walked the perimeter of the property one morning in March, exactly 2 years after they had moved in, on a day that had the same cold, bright quality as the moving day, the same particular blue sky after a long winter. She walked the fence line and along the creek and up to the oak where Barbara sat, unimpressed by her presence but tolerant of it, and then back across the field to the hatch. She stopped at the hatch and looked at it. The new door, steel and fitted, set level and clean in the concrete surround. The small sign beside it that said archive with an arrow pointing down, modest and functional. Below it, 60 feet of underground space full of things being carefully kept, staffed by people who understood that careful keeping was real work and deserved real support. Built on a foundation of absurd good fortune and 2 years of fighting for it. She thought about the first morning. The borrowed car on the gravel. The lockbox with the code 1947. The key that was heavy and old and made to last. The hatch that had required both hands, and a hard pull and a sound like something that had been waiting a very long time to be disturbed. She thought about Cora's voice at the top of those steps. "Mom, it's so dark in there." She put her hand on the door, felt the cool steel under her palm, felt the solidity of it, the weight of it, the particular quality of something built by people who knew what they were doing and cared about it lasting. She had $800. She had gone down into the dark. She had found $340 million and fought for it through everything that had come after and won, and she had used what winning gave her to build something that was supposed to outlast her, something for things that mattered and had nowhere to go. She thought about what it meant, not in the large abstract sense, not as a lesson or a symbol, in the particular and human sense, the sense of a woman who had sat in a shelter for 3 months staring at a ceiling and making lists of options that kept running into the same wall. The sense of a woman who had looked at a listing with 3 photographs and 17 words and $800 left in the world and made a decision that everyone would have told her not to make. She had gone towards something instead of away from it. She had gone down into the dark because the dark had something in it. She had been right. She was not always right. She had been right about this. She stood in the March morning with her hand on the archive door and thought about all the things that didn't survive being forgotten. All the things that needed a place and didn't have one. All the hatches in all the fields that nobody had thought to open. She thought, there is so much left to find. Not in this field. In every field. In every overlooked listing, in every dismissed opportunity, in every decision that looked foolish from the outside and made perfect sense from the inside. In every direction that everyone else was not going. In every question that sounded impractical until it turned out to be the only question that mattered. There is so much left to find. She opened the door. She went down. Below, in the cool and perfectly still air of the archive, she could hear Dr. Chukwu talking with the archivist about a new collection that had come in the day before. She could hear the quiet industry of careful people doing work that mattered in a building that was built to hold it. She could hear the faint hum of the climate control, steady and purposeful, keeping the temperature where it needed to be for things that were going to last. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stood in the corridor. The lights were warm and even. The steel shelving ran down the length of the room, organized and labeled, full of things being kept. The concrete walls were exactly as they had been when she came down for the first time with a flashlight and her daughter and no certainty about what was here. She had certainty now, not about everything, not about the future or about whether the things she was building would work the way she intended or about any of the 10,000 things that could not be known in advance, but about this place and what it was for, about the decision she had made in the common room of a shelter with $800 and a listing with 17 words, about what it meant to go towards something instead of away from it. She thought about Cora in the yellow room, about Gerald the rabbit in the garden, about Barbara and Beatrice in the oak, about Gerald Osei and his careful patience, about Francis, who had laughed exactly once, about Sable, who had built the stairs she was standing at the bottom of, about Douglas Pell, who had said yes to $800 because he just wanted to stop paying the taxes, about the code 1947 in the lockbox, about the key that was made to last. She walked down the corridor toward the sound of Chukwu and the archivist, past the shelves of carefully kept things, past the rooms that were full and the rooms that were waiting to be full, through the cool, still air of a place built for duration, by people who understood that some things required more time than one person could plan for. She was one person. She was planning for more than one person's time. She was building the long duration. She walked toward the voices of people doing the work she had made possible, the work that would continue after her in the way of things built properly, the way of things sheltered carefully, the way of things that did not need to be remembered every day in order to last, that could wait, that had the patience of well-built structures and the resilience of things kept in the dark. The archive held what it held. The field above it held its silence, and its crow, and its creek, and its garden, and its yellow room where a 7-year-old slept in the certainty that the floor would be there in the morning. It would be there. Renata had made sure of it. She was still making sure of it, every day, in every decision that moved the thing forward, that built the layer under the layer, that pressed the foundation deeper. She had $800. She had a hole in the ground. She had gone down into the dark. And from the dark, she had pulled a light large enough to last for a very long time. The letter she had not expected arrived on a Wednesday in October, 2.5 years after the hatch had first opened under her hands. It came in a standard envelope with a return address from a law office in a city she did not recognize, printed in the plain serif font of official correspondence, and it sat on her kitchen table for 20 minutes while she made coffee and read the morning and watched Barbara conduct some kind of territorial negotiation on the oak branch that appeared to require a great deal of posturing and very little resolution. She opened it eventually, the way she opened all official correspondence now, with the practiced attention of someone who had learned that the content of envelopes did not change based on how long you left them sealed. The letter was from an attorney named Philip Arden, representing the estate of a woman named Dorothea Crane, who had died in August at the age of 91. Dorothea Crane, the letter explained, had been a civil records administrator for the federal agency that had built and operated the Grover County facility in the 1950s and 60s. She had worked there during the facility's most active years and had maintained, over the subsequent decades of her retirement, a personal archive of documents related to the facility that she had kept in her home with the same methodical care she had applied to everything in her professional life. Upon her death, she had left instructions that this archive be offered to whoever currently held the deed to the Grover County property, on the grounds that it belonged there more logically than anywhere else she could think to send it. The archive consisted, the attorney wrote, of 42 boxes of documents, photographs, and operational materials, none of which had ever been part of the official government record, all of which had been in Dorothea Crane's personal possession since her retirement in 1974. Renata read the letter twice. Then she called Frances, not because she needed legal advice this time, but because Frances was the person she called when something happened that she needed to say out loud to someone who would understand its full dimensions. Frances listened. There was a pause. Then Frances said, "A woman who worked there kept her own copy of everything for 50 years and left it to whoever had the presence of mind to open the hatch." Renata said, "That appears to be accurate." Frances said, "Renata, I have been practicing law for 31 years. She said it the way she said things that had no real follow-up, as a complete statement, its meaning carried in the delivery. Renata drove to the city where the law office was located the following week, bringing Dr. Chukwu with her because Chukwu was the right person to assess what 42 boxes of historical documents represented before any decisions were made. They met Philip Arden in a conference room that had the particular neutral quality of rooms designed for the resolution of things, and he had the boxes stacked along one wall, each one labeled in a handwriting that was precise and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who wrote with the intention that what they wrote would be read. Chukwu spent 3 hours going through the boxes in a systematic sample, while Renata talked with the attorney and completed the necessary documentation. The transfer was straightforward, a bequest with no conditions beyond the delivery itself. Dorothea Crane had made no claims, asked for nothing, required nothing in return. She had simply decided, at some point in her 91 years, that the documents belonged with the place they documented, and she had arranged for that to happen. When Chukwu came out of the room where the boxes were stacked, her expression had the quality it got when she encountered something that exceeded her professional expectations, which was not a common occurrence. She said, "There are original engineering schematics in there that I did not believe still existed." She said, "There are personnel rosters, operational diaries, correspondence chains, procurement records." She said, "There is a complete photographic survey of the facility taken in 1958, interior and exterior, in conditions that suggest a professional photographer who understood what they were documenting." She said, "Renata, this is the primary source record for the facility. Everything that the official archive is missing, this is where it is." Renata thought about Dorothea Crane, 91 years old, dying in August, having kept 42 boxes of documents for 50 years in the same methodical care she had brought to everything, having decided, at some point, that the right thing to do with them was send them back. She thought about the quality of that kind of care, the kind that operated over decades without acknowledgement, without audience, because it was the right thing rather than because it was rewarded. She thought about what it cost to maintain that kind of attention over that kind of time. She asked Philip Arden if Dorothea Crane had any family. He said there was a grandniece, a woman in her 30s who lived in the same city. He said Dorothea had left her most of the estate, that the document archive was the only thing specifically directed elsewhere. Renata asked for the grandniece's contact information if it could be shared. He said he would check with her. The grandniece's name was Simone. She called Renata 3 days later, a little uncertain, a little curious, and Renata talked with her for an hour about Dorothea, about what she had been like, about the boxes of documents she had kept all those years. Simone said her great-aunt had been the most organized person she had ever known and also the most private, that she had never talked much about the work she had done before retirement, that the boxes had been in a spare room that nobody was allowed to enter without invitation. She said she had known they existed but had not known what they contained until the attorney had explained it. She said, she never explained why she kept them. She just kept them. Renata said, "I think she understood they mattered." Simone was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, she knew about you. She had followed the whole thing, the legal case, the discovery, the archive you were building." She said, "I found the articles in her papers." She had printed them out and kept them. Renata sat with that. A 91-year-old woman in a city she had never visited, reading articles about the hatch and the bunker and the $340 million in the archive, keeping them the way she kept everything, with methodical care, having already decided what to do with her own archive when the time came. She invited Simone to visit the property whenever she wanted. She said she would like to show her where the documents had gone. She said she thought Dorothea would have appreciated knowing they were properly housed. Simone said she thought so too. She said she would come in the spring. The 42 boxes arrived at the archive on a Thursday in November, transported in a climate-controlled vehicle Chukwu had arranged through her professional network. They were received and logged and assessed, and given their initial conservation treatment before being added to the collection that was growing with a consistency that had begun to feel less like accumulation and more like inevitability, like the space was drawing to it the things it was built to hold. The archivist, whose name was Bernard and who had become in the previous year and a half one of the most essential people in Renata's working life, spent 2 weeks processing Dorothea's collection with the focused attention he brought to everything. He produced a finding aid that was organized and thorough, and which he brought to Renata one morning with an expression that she had come to recognize as his version of excitement, which was a very controlled version that mostly manifested as a slight increase in the speed at which he spoke. He said, "The 1958 photographic survey alone is a complete documentation of a type of federal infrastructure installation that has never been comprehensively photographed." He said, "From a historical standpoint, this collection is significant beyond the specific context of this facility." He said, "There are researchers who have spent careers looking for materials like this." Renata said, "Then let's make sure they can find them." The question of access had been something she and Chukwu and Bernard had been developing a framework for since the archive opened. The materials needed to be preserved, which required control. They also needed to be used, which required access. These were not contradictory requirements, but they were in tension in the way that all genuine preservation work involved tension between the thing and its use, between keeping and sharing. They had built the access framework carefully, with input from researchers and institutions who had used similar archives. Qualified researchers could access most materials through an appointment system. Digital reproductions of non-sensitive materials would be made available through a research portal that Bernard was developing with the help of a digital preservation specialist Renata had hired in the summer. Certain categories of materials, particularly the operational documentation with personal information, required a more structured request process. The first external researcher arrived in January, a historian from a university 3 hours away who was writing about the civil defense infrastructure of the post-war period and had found the archive through a reference in Mara's article. He was a careful, methodical man in his mid-40s who treated the documents with the respect they deserved and asked good questions, and stayed for 3 days and left with his research notes and an expression of sustained disbelief that he had found this place. He published an article in an academic journal that spring that cited the archive 12 times and described it, in the acknowledgments, as an extraordinary and unexpected resource whose existence represented both a remarkable story of individual discovery and a significant contribution to the preservation of a largely underdocumented period of American institutional history. He sent Renata a copy with a handwritten note that said simply, "Thank you for opening the door." She put it in the folder with the other letters. The folder was thick now, 2 years of letters from people who had read about the hatch and the bunker and the archive, people who had their own stories, people who had been moved by something in the story that they could not always name precisely, but which they wrote toward anyway, putting words on paper because the experience of reading about it had generated something in them that required expression. She read every letter still. She answered what she could. One of the letters that arrived that spring was from a woman named Patricia Wells who lived in a small town in a neighboring state and who described herself as a retired schoolteacher with too much time and too many boxes in her attic. She wrote that she had inherited her father's papers when he died 15 years earlier, that her father had been a local politician and civic leader for 40 years and had kept everything: correspondence, meeting minutes, photographs, clippings, the entire accumulated documentary record of a small community's public life over 4 decades. She said she had kept the boxes because she could not bear to throw them away, but she had no idea what to do with them, and they had been in her attic getting slowly damaged by the heat and cold for 15 years, and she had read about the archive and thought, that is where these belong. Renata called her. They talked for an hour. Patricia described the boxes in detail, the way a person describes something they have been carrying for a long time and want desperately to put down safely rather than just put down. She said her father had cared about the record. She said he had believed that the specific history of small places mattered, that what happened in a small town was as real and worth keeping as what happened in cities, even if nobody outside the town cared about it. She said she had believed this too, which was why she had kept the boxes. But she was 73 years old and her attic was not a proper archive, and she was running out of time to solve the problem. Renata said, "We can take them." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Just like that?" Renata said, "Just like that." Bernard drove to Patricia's town the following month with 2 colleagues and a van equipped for document transport. They spent 2 days assessing and properly packing the boxes, and Patricia made them lunch both days and showed them photographs of her father at various points of his civic career and told them stories about the town that Bernard said afterward were as valuable as the documents in terms of context. When the boxes were loaded and the van was ready to leave, Patricia stood on her porch and watched it go with an expression that Renata understood from the description Bernard gave her when he returned. The expression of someone who has been holding something for someone else for a very long time and has finally been able to give it to the person it was meant for. It had been meant for the archive. Patricia had known it. She had just needed somewhere real to send it. The Patricia Wells donation generated something Renata had not fully anticipated: word among a certain community of people who had boxes in attics. People who had inherited documents and materials that they believed mattered but had no institutional home, who had been keeping them out of a sense of obligation rather than any clear sense of what to do next. These people found each other, as people with shared concerns found each other, through the particular networks of community and correspondence and connection that had always existed and continued to exist, and through those networks they found the archive. The inquiries came in slowly at first, and then more steadily. Bernard developed an intake protocol. Chuck Wu refined the assessment criteria. A conservation specialist Renata had hired in the fall began working through the backlog of materials that needed stabilization before they could be properly housed. The archive was full of purposeful activity in a way that had an organic quality, the quality of something that had found its reason and was operating within it. Renata walked through it on a regular basis, not as an inspection, but as a presence, the way you are present in a place that is yours in the deep sense, the sense that goes past ownership into something more like responsibility. She spoke with the staff. She looked at what was coming in and what was being processed and what was being made accessible. She thought about Dorothea Crane keeping her 42 boxes for 50 years, and Patricia Wells keeping her father's papers for 15, and all the other people and all the other addicts who had been holding things that mattered and waiting for somewhere to send them. The archive was that somewhere. She had built it. It was working. There was a particular afternoon in March that stayed with her, the kind of afternoon that locates itself permanently in memory not because of anything dramatic that happened during it, but because of the quality of the light and the feeling of the moment and the specific convergence of things that made it feel like a crystallization of everything that had preceded it. She had been in the main archive room, going through the finding aid for Dorothea Crane's collection with Bernard, when Cora appeared at the top of the stairs. Cora came down to the archive sometimes after school, not for any specific reason, just because it was part of her world, and she moved through all parts of her world with the same thoroughgoing curiosity. She came down the stairs with her school bag and Gerald the rabbit, who had been given a harness the previous year and now accompanied Cora on approved outings with the dignified tolerance of a rabbit who had decided that humans were manageable if firm expectations were established early. Cora came into the main room and looked at the shelves the way she always did, running her eyes across the labeled sections with the reading habit that she applied to any text in her environment. She had asked Bernard once about the finding aids, and he had explained them, and she had then spent 20 minutes reading through the one for the County Historical Society materials with the concentrated interest she gave to things she had decided were worth her attention. She put her bag down near the door and sat in the chair that had become, over time, understood as Cora's chair, a straight-back thing near the door that nobody else ever sat in when she was there. She took out a book. She began to read. The rabbit sat on the floor beside her with the composure of an animal who had made peace with unusual circumstances. Renata looked at her daughter reading in the archive, in the room below the field, in the building under the ground she owned, and felt the full weight and the full lightness of it simultaneously, the way you feel things that are too large and too simple to be only one thing. She thought about the shelter, the narrow bed, the ceiling she had stared at, the list she had made in the dark. She thought about the common room computer and the listing and the 17 words. She thought about the steps going down into darkness and Cora's voice at the top of them. She thought about $800, the last $800, spent on a hole in the ground. She looked at the shelves full of carefully kept things, at Bernard working at his desk with the focused attention of a person doing work that mattered, at the preservation specialist in the adjacent room examining a document with a light and a magnifying glass, her whole attention given to a single fragile page that someone had kept for decades and sent here to be kept for decades more. She looked at her daughter reading in the chair that had become her chair, with the rabbit and the school bag and the particular quality of ease that a child has in a place that is genuinely home. This was what the $800 had bought. Not just the assets, not just the money, not just the legal victory and the vindication and the end of the particular fear of running out. All of that was real, and she did not minimize it. But underneath it, foundational to it in the way that foundations were foundational, quiet and invisible, and carrying everything above them, was this. This room, this work, this child in this chair. This was the thing that lasted. Bernard looked up from his desk and caught her expression and had the good sense to say nothing, only nod once and return to his work. She appreciated this about Bernard. He understood that some moments required nothing added to them. The spring research season brought 3 more visiting scholars. 2 were working on related aspects of the civil defense period and had found each other through the first historian's published article. The third was a documentary filmmaker who was developing a project about post-war American infrastructure and had written to ask whether the archive would consider participating. Renata met with all of them, assessed each situation with the care she brought to decisions that affected the archive's integrity, and made choices that balanced openness with the preservation mandate. The filmmaker she spent the most time thinking about. A documentary meant cameras, meant the archive becoming visible in a different and more public way than the academic articles had made it. She thought about the journalist's careful letter. She thought about how she had waited until she understood the full shape of the thing before she was ready to talk about it publicly. She thought about what the archive was now, 18 months into its operation, whether it had the substance and the rootedness to withstand the kind of attention a documentary brought without being distorted by it. She decided it did. She said yes, with conditions that the filmmaker accepted thoughtfully and in full. The conditions were straightforward. The documentary would represent the archive as it actually was, not as a dramatic backdrop to the treasure story. The staff would be treated as the central figures they were, not as supporting characters to Renata's narrative. The materials in the archive would be handled with the same protocols applied to all research access. And the story of how the archive came to exist would be told accurately and completely, including the parts that were not cinematic, the legal filings, and the financial structures, and the methodical daily work of preservation, because those parts were the actual story, and the dramatic parts made no sense without them. The filmmaker, whose name was Yolanda, said she had come specifically because she wanted to make a film about the actual story rather than the simplified version. She said the simplified version, Woman Finds Treasure, would make a shorter and less interesting film than what had actually happened. Renata said she appreciated that. They began working together in April. Yolanda and a small crew spent several weeks at the property, filming the daily operations of the archive, interviewing Bernard and Chukwu and the conservation specialist and the researchers who came through. They filmed the surface of the property, the field and the oak and the creek and the house. They filmed the hatch, the stairs, the corridor. They filmed Renata at work and in conversation with the staff and sitting on the porch in the evenings. They also filmed Cora, with Cora's enthusiastic consent and Renata's careful oversight, because Cora had opinions about the documentary and wanted them represented. She told Yolanda with complete directness that the most important thing to understand about the archive was that it was for things that mattered and didn't have anywhere to go, and that she knew this because she and her mother had been that before they had found the hatch. She said it with the particular candor of a child who has processed something thoroughly and sees no reason to be circumspect about what she has concluded. Yolanda filmed this. She said afterward to Renata that it was going to be the heart of the film. She said it with the certainty of someone who knew what they were looking for and had just found it. Renata said she thought Cora would probably want to review the final cut. Yolanda said she would absolutely provide that. The summer that followed was the busiest the archive had yet experienced. For research visits, 2 new collections received, the conservation specialist promoted to lead conservator and given a small team. The digital portal that Bernard had been developing with the preservation technologist launched in a limited beta with a waiting list of researchers who had heard about it and wanted access. The work had a momentum now that was self-generating in the way of things that had found their level, things that were doing what they were supposed to be doing in conditions that supported it. Renata's own role continued to evolve. She was less in the day-to-day operations now, which was deliberate, which was the point. She had built the thing to run without her. It was beginning to do that. Her work had shifted toward the long-term financial stewardship, the decisions about the endowment and its management, the evaluation of new collection opportunities, the relationships with the institutions and researchers and communities that brought materials and brought questions. She was also thinking about replication, not of the archive itself, which was specific to its location and its history in a way that could not simply be reproduced, but the model, the idea of small underground or otherwise protected preservation spaces in underserved communities, spaces that could hold the materials of local and regional history that the large institutional archives could not or would not take. She had been in conversation with Chukwu about this for months, and with 2 other preservation specialists Chukwu had connected her with, and the conversations were beginning to have the shape of something that could become concrete. She thought about Patricia Wells and her father's boxes in the attic. She thought about how many Patricia Wellses there were, in how many small towns, keeping how many boxes of things that mattered, waiting for somewhere to send them. She thought about what it would take to build enough somewheres to meet that need, or at least to begin meeting it, to demonstrate that the model worked and could be supported and could be sustained. She brought this to Gerald Osei at their quarterly meeting in August. She laid out the thinking carefully, the way she laid everything out, the problem and the approach and the financial structure that might support it, and the indicators she would use to assess whether it was working. She had a document prepared, 12 pages, organized and specific. He read it while she sat across the table. He took his time. When he finished, he put it down and looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize from him. The expression of someone whose expectations had been exceeded and who was recalibrating accordingly. He said, "This is the second phase." She said, "Yes." He said, "You've been thinking about this for a while." She said, "Since before the archive opened." He said, "How many facilities are you thinking to start?" She said, 3. In communities that have clear need and no existing institutional capacity. She said, "I want to understand the replication process before I think about scale." He said, "That is exactly right." He said it with the emphasis he gave to things he considered genuinely correct. He said, "Let's build the model." They spent 2 hours working through the financial structure of what she was calling, in her own notes, the second phase. 3 pilot preservation facilities, modestly built, staffed by local archivists with support from the main archive's experienced team, focused on materials from their specific communities and regions, connected to each other and to the Grover County Archive through shared protocols and the digital portal. The cost was significant, but not extraordinary relative to the resources available. The endowment Gerald Osei had structured could support it without compromising the main archive's long-term sustainability. The question was not whether it could be done financially, but whether it could be done well, whether the model was robust enough to work in different contexts with different communities and different materials. That was what the pilots were for. That was why she was starting with 3. She drove home from the meeting in the late afternoon, the same drive she had made in the borrowed car on that first Tuesday morning, the roads that grew quieter as the city receded behind her. She had made this drive hundreds of times now. She knew every turn of it, every landmark. She knew where the county road began and where the gravel turnoff appeared and how the field looked from the approach, the oak visible first, and then the surface of the house, and then the hatch. She pulled onto the gravel and parked and sat in the car for a moment before getting out. The sun was dropping behind the trees at the back of the property. The light was golden in the way of summer evenings, long and particular, the kind of light that made the ordinary field look like something someone had painted on purpose. Barbara was in the oak. Beatrice was on the fence. The creek was audible from here if she was quiet enough to listen for it. She thought about the first time she had driven up this road. The borrowed car, the cold gray morning, the field as it had been then, overgrown and flat and indifferent. The lockbox, the code, the key. She thought about what she had said to herself that first morning, standing at the hatch. She had told herself to be methodical. She had told herself not to let herself hope too hard before she knew what was there. She had told herself to go down and see. She had gone down and seen. Everything that followed, the discovery and the legal battle and the building of the archive and Dorothea Crane's 42 boxes and Patricia Wells's father's papers and Bernard's finding aids and Chuckwoo's conservation work and Cora's chair in the archive room and Gerald the rabbit and Barbara and Beatrice and the yellow room and the creek named Gerald's Creek and the second phase that was becoming real in her notes and her conversations and her 12-page document. All of it had followed. From that. From going down. From choosing, at the edge of nothing, to go towards something instead of away from it. She got out of the car. She walked across the field toward the house, past the hatch, past the oak where Barbara watched her go with the sideways professional interest she had never relinquished. The evening air smelled of grass and something from the creek, cool and clean and particular to this place. She had $800. She had gone down into the dark. She had found what she found. And she was still finding it, every day, in the work and the letters and the boxes from addicts and the researchers who came with their careful questions and the staff who did the long, quiet daily work of keeping things. She was still finding it in Cora's voice when she talked about the archive at school, explaining it to friends who had not seen it yet with the proprietary enthusiasm of someone who understood a thing from the inside. She was still finding it in the look on Bernard's face when he encountered something in a collection that exceeded his expectations, in the way Chuckwoo touched documents, in the particular satisfaction of the conservation specialist when she stabilized something fragile and extended its life by decades. She was still finding it in the field on evenings like this one, in the light that turned everything gold, in the creek that ran cold and clear, in the place that had been a hole in the ground and was now a home and an archive and the beginning of something that was going to continue past her in the way of things built properly. The hatch caught the last of the light as she passed it. The steel door, fitted and solid and well-made. Beneath it, 60 feet of deliberate endurance, full of things being carefully kept, full of people doing the long, quiet work that mattered. She kept walking toward the house, toward the yellow light in the kitchen window where Cora was making dinner, toward the evening and the tomorrow and the 12-page document and the 3 pilot facilities and everything the second phase would bring. She was still going toward things instead of away from them. She was always going to be that woman. She walked into the light. The first pilot facility opened on a Tuesday. She had not planned the day deliberately. It simply fell on a Tuesday, the same day of the week she had driven to Grover County for the first time in a borrowed car with a flashlight and 2 granola bars and the last $800 she had in the world. She noticed this only after the fact, when she was driving home and the day of the week settled into her awareness and sat there quietly, carrying its small weight of coincidence. The facility was in a rural county 4 hours south, in a community whose local historical records had been housed for decades in a church basement that flooded every other spring and whose congregation had been apologizing about it for years without having the means to solve it. Renata had found them through one of the letters in the folder, written by a pastor who had read about the archive and described the situation with the plain-spoken directness of someone who had been managing an impossible problem for too long and was not too proud to ask for help. She had driven down in January to see it herself. She had stood in the church basement looking at the water stains on the boxes and the warped corners of folders that had been wet and dried too many times, and she had felt the particular ache of things being slowly lost not through neglect, but through the absence of resources to do better. The pastor had stood beside her without speaking, which she appreciated. She had seen enough. She had already made up her mind before she left the parking lot. The new facility was not underground. The geography did not allow for it, and the underground element had never been the point. The point was duration, was shelter, was the particular quality of a space designed to hold things carefully through whatever came. The building they had constructed was modest and above ground, purpose-built, climate-controlled, staffed by 2 local archivists trained by Bernard, who drove down twice to work alongside them through the intake of the first collections. On the opening day, the pastor said a few words. The archivist said a few words. A local historian who had driven an hour to be there said a few words. Renata said almost nothing, because the work itself was what needed to speak, and it was already speaking in the organized shelves and the clean climate-controlled air and the boxes of rescued documents that were being properly housed for the first time in their existence. Cora had asked that morning if she could come. Renata had said yes. Cora stood beside her during the brief remarks and looked at the facility with the assessing eye she brought to everything, running it across the shelves and the environmental controls and the new intake desk where the archivists were already processing a collection. She was 9 now. She had grown into her curiosity, which had always been large, with an increasing capacity to ask questions that went to the center of things rather than around them. On the drive home, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "How many more are there going to be?" Renata said, 2 more in the first phase. Then we'll see. Cora looked out the window at the landscape moving past. She said, "There are a lot of basements with boxes in them." Renata said, "I know." Cora said, "Good." She said it the way she said things she considered settled, with a finality that closed the subject not through dismissal but through completion, through having understood the thing fully enough to put it down. Then she went back to her book. Renata drove. The road unrolled ahead of her in the afternoon light, long and particular, the kind of road that led somewhere worth going. She thought about Tuesday, about the first one and this one and all the ones between them, about what a person could do with $800 and the willingness to go down into the dark, about basements and attics and fields and all the places where things waited to be found by someone with the stubbornness to look. She drove toward home. There was still so much left to find. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.